Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 20th meeting of the Public Petitions Committee in 2019. Our first agenda item is the consideration of continued petitions. The first petition for consideration today is Petition 1674 on managing the cat population, lodged by Ellie Stirling. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to review the Code of Practice under the Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Act 2011 and to identify measures which could be introduced to control the soaring domestic cat population and protect the existence of the Scottish wildcat. At the last consideration of this petition in May 2019, the committee agreed to invite the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform to give evidence at a future meeting. So I'm pleased to welcome the Cabinet Secretary, Rosanna Cunningham, today, along with Scottish Government officials Andrew Vos, the Veterinary Head of Animal Welfare, and Hugh Dignan, Head of Welfare and Biodiversity Unit. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to provide a brief opening statement before we move to questions?
Okay, thank you, Convener. I wasn't advised you were looking for an opening statement, so this will be an extremely ad hoc set of comments, other than to say that, I mean, obviously the Government has animal health and welfare under consideration at all times, and the decisions that we make on the basis of what the balance of the right thing to do is. The Scottish Wildcat Action is a very important part of the work we do, and a lot of the work that is centred around unneutered cats is in those areas, those particular areas of Scotland where wildcats have been traditionally associated and are still there, although in very small numbers. So that is where most of our effort in respect of the unneutered feral cat population has to be focused.
Thanks very much for that. The petitioner has stated that since the Scottish Government's submission in July 2018, important evidence has become available concerning the high and accelerating numbers of unneutered cats. I wonder if you can, the Cabinet Secretary can tell us if she's aware of this new evidence, and if so, to what extent has this affected the Scottish Government's position on this petition?
Well, I mean, our position is still, broadly speaking, that there isn't the empirical evidence that people might expect to see. There's a certain amount of theoretical projections, and I think that is what is being suggested as evidence. But we have considered the theoretical projections. We've looked at them in terms of projections of an increase in cat numbers, assuming they're unneutered. So there's a lot of inbuilt uncertainties and assumptions in and around that. And you could apply similar projections to almost any other species and come up with a sort of theoretical set of numbers. The issue is whether or not there is empirical evidence that supports that. Now, we do recognise that there is a relative excess of cats in Scotland compared to homes for cats, and that's overall. But our understanding and awareness is that in many areas the supply of kittens and the demand for kittens is pretty much in balance. So this is a sort of issue where the numbers question is more geographically located rather than across the whole of Scotland.
Of ensuring that the evidence is updated, that where there is research that you're following it?
It is difficult, I think, and I'll speak to both officials in regard to this, because one of the difficulties is in cases of unneutered cats, which group of unneutered cats are you actually measuring? I'm aware that the vast majority of domestic pets are neutered. Most owners do that as a matter of course. I'm conscious that there are some owners who, for odd reasons, choose not to. But unneutered cats in the middle of Edinburgh or Glasgow aren't effectively in the same category as we would say unneutered cats in rural areas such as Angus and Aberdeenshire, where they may then become feral, although not all unneutered cats do become feral. And it is the feral unneutered population that is the problem in terms of wildcats. So it's a kind of complicated picture. So where we try to do the measurements, I mean, I don't think we would have an assessment of unneutered domestic moggies in places like Edinburgh and Glasgow. It would be difficult to do that. Andrew may correct me, but I think that would be a very difficult thing to measure. The measurements are much more likely to be attempted in a feral cat population to see whether or not, to see what those numbers are, and we can estimate what the growth in the populations there are. So it isn't just as easy as a single figure.
It was more that if the petitioner's contention is that you're making decisions on the basis of evidence that's not updated, there was the question is how do you ensure that you keep yourself alive to the potential of these issues?
Well,
just a process
I think I've kind of made the point actually that there's more assessment and focus on the unneutered feral population than there will be on the unneutered domestic population, particularly given that the vast majority of domestic cats effectively live in urban areas, not rural areas. So I don't know whether or not, Hugh, you want to talk about how we try to measure numbers of unneutered feral cats, and that is part and parcel of a lot of the work that's been done by Scottish Wildcat Action. So that is an ongoing set of work that is constantly being updated. It has to be, because it is focused specifically on the survival of the wildcat species.
Okay. Do you want to add anything at this point?
I think the work that goes on in relation to the management of the feral cat population in wildcat areas obviously now focuses very much on the priority areas where there is hope that wildcat populations can be re-established. Excuse me. And in those areas, the aim has been to reduce by a certain amount, to reduce the feral cat population by over 75%, and that has been very difficult to achieve. So I think where efforts are going to be focused now reflects the development of the wildcat programme, which is now looking at a captive breeding and release approach and a reinforcement approach, which is likely going to be focused on a release site somewhere in the Cairngorms area, which will mean a real focus of effort on reducing the feral cat population in that area. So even before the release goes ahead. So I think it reflects the difficulty of the problem. When you get to try to deal with feral cats in rural areas, I mean, these are cats which are effectively living very much like wildcats. They're difficult to find, they're difficult to trap, they're in remote areas. It's often, difficult weather conditions and so on. So it's not like trapping urban cats, which itself isn't easy, but would suggest considerably easier than working in the remote areas where you would like to see the re-establishment of a wildcat population. So I'm afraid I don't have numbers on how many feral cats there are in those areas. Suffice it to say that there is a lot of hard work going on to reduce that population as far as possible, to make sure that population is neutered before there is any attempt to release captive bred cats into that area.
Thank you for that. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. In her submission received in March, the petitioner states that the proposed threshold set out in the consultation licensing of dog, cat and rabbit breeding activities in Scotland would not help to prevent the present high level of pet cat overpopulation. I wonder what analysis the Scottish Government have carried out regarding the impact of its proposals on the domestic cat population.
Well, I think what we need to clarify here is that was not the purpose of that guidance. That wasn't the reason for the guidance. We weren't setting out to do those kinds of studies. This was based on welfare issues, not on numbers, and it was based on welfare issues basically that arose out of the kind of intensive commercial breeding that is beginning to be a problem amongst a number of pet species. So that was what the proposals were behind. So they weren't really aimed at reducing populations of any species, and not aimed at reducing populations of cats. So that has not been a part of what we were actually doing. And we are considering, we are continuing to develop legislation, obviously, and there's a bill, as members will know, that is going through on animal welfare issues just now, and we're discussing a threshold for cat breeders in terms of, but again in terms of welfare. So our focus has been on welfare issues, not on numbers. If we were to try and add numbers into it, we would be changing the basis of what that guidance was all about. We consulted, and it was a consultation on welfare issues. So whether it helps in terms of assessing numbers, I don't know. But trying to assess the numbers of any of the pet populations in the UK or in Scotland, I suspect would be quite difficult.
Yeah, I think, as the Cabinet Secretary said, the purpose of the consultation on licensing proposals was to address the concerns about practices associated with breeding, mostly of puppies, but also of cats and rabbits, that people are concerned about the way these animals can be bred commercially in unsuitable conditions, and we're probably all aware of the concerns about puppy farms, for example. So that was really what was driving the consultation, and that is going to be taken forward in licensing legislation that was announced in the programme for government. So that will be a package of licensing of animal activities, including licensing of animal sanctuaries and rehoming centres, licensing of dog, cat and rabbit breeders, and licensing of pet sales. So that's work that we're currently engaged on, and we're currently discussing with organisations such as Cat Protection and the other animal welfare organisations what exactly the licence conditions should be, and whether it's appropriate to apply a threshold of a certain number of breeding animals before you need to be licensed. So that's really what the question was about. But the purpose is to address those concerns rather than to control populations.
So it may indirectly impact on the numbers of cats, but that was not the basis on which it was designed. So it wouldn't be appropriate to use that aspect of things in order to try and talk about the cat population, because that was not what it was meant for.
Okay, thank you. If I could, again, in the most recent submission, the petitioner states that the rising number of unneutered domestic and feral living cats in Scotland means that the large population of domestic cat production each year will inevitably die from starvation, disease and injury. I wonder what your response to that submission would be.
Well, I mean, I saw that, and I mean, obviously health and welfare of all animals is a major concern for everybody. But first of all, I think, as I indicated in, I think, an earlier answer, the vast majority of domestic cats are actually neutered, not unneutered, and they're neutered because their owners, or perhaps in the case of cats, we shouldn't be saying owners, we should be saying cohabitees, have ensured that that is the case and believe it's the right thing to do. So, you know, I think we're talking, in terms of the domestic cat population, a relatively small number of cats that are left unneutered. And they may be for a variety of reasons. Do unneutered cats in and of themselves necessarily end up living in terrible circumstances? Well, no, because a proportion of the unneutered cats are still being looked after and cared for by those with whom they share their lives. And it is only the smaller proportion who go feral that could end up causing a problem in terms of both their own health and welfare and the impact on the wildcats. But those who go feral are effectively living, as Hugh Dignan said, the same lives that the cat species lives in the natural environment. So they are subject to a lot of the same problems and pressures that any wild animal is subject to. Yes, that is the case. So I could hardly pretend that there weren't a proportion of feral cats who will suffer, who will die for various reasons, as happens in a wild population of any species, and that is the case. Now, if the answer to that is to neuter every single cat, domestic cat in Scotland, even if it's gone feral, for those reasons, you know, but we don't apply that standard to those that are already wild species, then it's an interesting juxtaposition of how we see health and welfare of an animal.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Cabinet Secretary, in the consultation that you spoke about just now, and also that you mentioned in the submission from July, were there any plans for a requirement to microchip cats in the same way as we do dogs? And could you see any issues with that happening if we were to introduce that?
Well, we're not currently considering compulsory microchipping for cats. I mean, traditionally we understand, and any of us who've got any relationship with cats knows that their behaviour is not like dogs. They're not dogs, you know, in terms of the way they interact. That microchipping therefore has less of an effective impact on a cat population than it would on the dog population. So at the moment we are not convinced of the necessity of compulsory microchipping to be required for all cats, although as with neutering, I believe in actual fact a lot of people who have cats are choosing to do that in any case. So microchipping may become something much more the norm, but it's the norm by choice rather than on a compulsory basis. And in any case, compulsory microchipping would only impact on those cats that are living in a domestic setting, not those who are part of a feral population. So it still wouldn't reach every single cat. This is the slight difficulty of the terminology here for, you know, domestic cats that have gone feral, and their families will not be microchipped.
Cats Protection, and I should declare an interest as a member, often do free neutering programmes in association with their local veterinary practices. What help can the Scottish Government give to Cats Protection to help promote that within the general public?
Well, Cats Protection, they do a tremendous amount of very good work, and I think we would always want to encourage neutering of pet animals for a whole lot of very, very good reasons. And this is where I have both the wild and the domestic side here. But our focus on the issues that have to do with domestic cats is mostly on the feral cats, and of course they would have nobody. I mean, we are already doing that work, if you like, through a different programme. So, we need to focus our efforts on that for very good reasons. But because of that, you know, there was a very good campaign run, and I saw a lot of it on social media with Supercat. So that was Supercat, the domestic moggy, who was, you know, happily going to be neutered so that it could save its wild cousin. Now, I know that sounds trite, but it was obviously, you know, the point about it was actually bringing home to people that neutering their cat wasn't just about not having successive litters of kittens they have to then ensure get good homes, but also reduce the potential impact. And that kind of campaigning, we would prefer to focus on those areas that are within the current boundaries of what we consider to be where the wild cats are, because that's the most serious bit of the issue that needs to be dealt with in terms of domestic moggies that are feral and have resulted in feral generations in the Scottish countryside.
So to take your point then about the Scottish wildcat, do you agree with the petitioner's assertion that high numbers of unneutered feral cats are a significant threat to its existence?
Well, yes, of course we do, because that's what the evidence and the science tells us, which is why we focus so much effort on the unneutered feral cat populations in the areas where we are trying to at least stabilise the existing wild cat population. And that is why we want our focus and our resources to be focused there. And there are some, you know, there have been some, there's a range of activities around that, and that does include assessing the numbers of unneutered ferals, particularly unneutered ferals, although we have to assess the whole population in those priority areas. And we do undertake the trap, neuter, vaccinate and release programmes. The intention is to try to achieve the 75% of a feral population that are caught by that programme. But as Hugh Dignan referred to, it isn't terribly easy, because cats, when they go feral, revert to effectively a wild cat lifestyle, which is they are nocturnal, they are elusive, so it isn't easy, it can't be done quickly, and it does take quite a lot of time and resource.
You get support from local landowners in the areas where you're trying to do the trap, neuter, vaccinate, release programme?
In my experience, in the main, yes, I've visited some very good estates where they're quite keen to be assisting in that. And Hugh might want to say something else, but it is my experience that most of the estates in these areas, this is one of the things of which they're keen to be seen to do good things, and they do.
Yes, I would completely endorse that. The project has had good support from Scottish Land and Estates and from the Scottish gamekeepers, who've played a role in that. And in terms of the trap, neuter, vaccinate, release TNVR programme, that often has to work with the consent of people like local farmers, where there are often populations of cats in and around farm buildings. And so I think, you know, there are some people, as is always the way, who are not as cooperative as you might hope, but I think by and large the picture has been one of good cooperation from people who are generally concerned about conserving the Scottish wildcat.
And just to pick up on the question that was asked earlier about affordability of some of these things, the Supercat campaign is effectively promoting chipping and vaccination and all of these things of domestic cats, but it does work with local veterinary services, and it does provide vouchers for people who can't pay. So, you know, we are cognizant of that being an issue, but again, we're focusing that in the areas, the priority areas for wildcats, because that's where the real crunch point comes.
David Torrance.
Good morning, everyone. Cabinet Secretary, by 2019, the Scottish Wildcat Conservation Action Plan aimed to have secured at least 5 stable populations of Scottish wildcat in the wild, a better understanding of the wildcat distribution, numbers, genetics and extent of hybridisation, and a greater local awareness of the threats posed by domestic cats, feral cats and hybrids to wildcats, and of the features that distinguish them. Have these aims been achieved?
I think probably 2 out of the 3, I can say yes. We certainly have, and there's been a lot of work done in this area over the last couple of years. We've certainly got a far better understanding of the numbers of wildcats, the genetics, particularly the genetics. There's been a lot of advances in genetics over the years, and the extent of hybridisation, and that has. It seems to me, developed at pace over the last couple of years in a way which wasn't really available to us before. And if people follow some of the appropriate accounts on social media, they'll see that there's a lot of work being done now with communication to the public about how and when, you know, they are seeing a wildcat or seeing a hybrid, and how to do the identification. So it's becoming a lot more understandable for people. There's a lot more local awareness, I think, of the problems that are posed by domestic cats, feral cats, hybridized cats to wild cats, and you know, that awareness is partly being helped by the campaigning and the programmes of bringing it to people's attention. So that both those areas we have done. What's been much more problematic is the issue of securing at least 5 stable populations of Scottish wildcats in the wild. So I think there's really only perhaps one area where it might have been approached, because what the other 2 things have uncovered is how much more at risk wildcats have been than had hitherto been understood, which is actually why you will have heard over the last week or so some additional projects that are being brought into play now that haven't been used in the past, and that's effectively an internal reintroduction from the cats that have been wildcats, true wildcats that have been bred in captivity and will be released back into or released into the wild, and that way we will know that that is a population of genetically pure wildcats, and that work is going to start quite soon.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and Mr Dignan and Mr Verse. The Scottish Government's submission recently highlighted concerns that to compulsory microchip and neuter owned and domestic cats, as called for by the petitioner, was unnecessary in areas where there were no Scottish wildcats. Now, the petitioners challenged these concerns, stating that pet cat offspring are sold and transported the length of the country. Now, she states also that the wildcat territories, present and potential, are not far from human settlements, which is where unneutered pet cats are. How would the Cabinet Secretary, would you respond to this for what the petition is saying?
I think some of what I've already been saying indicates kind of the way we are approaching it. I don't deny that there are some urban areas in those 5 priority areas, but that is why we are focusing very much on those priority areas and the people who have domestic pets in those areas. That's why the campaigning and the effort is focused on those areas rather than areas where the likelihood of cats interfacing with wildcats is vanishingly small, and so this really is a kind of resource, focus issue. If we were to talk about this just as a blanket thing all over Scotland, you would be capturing populations of domestic cats who will never, in 100 years, ever be in a situation where a wildcat was on their territory, or that they were intruding on a wildcat territory. That's not the case for the 5 priority areas. So the 5 priority areas have to be where we extend most of our focus and effort. And the notion that, the notion that we would apply to a domestic moggy in the middle of Glasgow the same rule that we need to think about for those 5 priority areas would seem to me to be a dispersal of resource that isn't really justified in the current circumstances.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of our questions, and we just maybe want to reflect on what action the committee further want to take. And I do appreciate the time the Cabinet Secretary has given to us and her officials. It's clear it's a matter of it's not an area that probably a lot of people know an awful lot about, but there are clearly some concerns, and I think your responses have been very useful. In terms of how we take this forward, it may be that we simply take the opportunity to reflect on the evidence and then come back, with a conclusion. But it does feel as if a lot of the issues have been addressed by the Cabinet Secretary. Yeah. Okay. Okay, in that case, what we will do is then reflect on the evidence and return to it in a future meeting. But can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and their officials again for their attendance? And I shall suspend briefly. Okay, if I can bring the meeting back to order. And the next petition for consideration is petition 1595 on a moratorium on shared space schemes lodged by Alexander Taylor. At our last consideration of this petition in March of this year, we agreed to write to the Scottish Government to ask how the petitioner can be part of its work on shared spaces. We also asked for the Scottish Government's position on whether a decision on shared space is an issue for local authorities and for its views on the UK Government's decision to withdraw guidance in relation to shared space. A response has been received, as well as a written submission from the petitioner, both of which are included in our papers. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
I was interested to see that the Department for Transport, the group, the Scottish Government submission group that the DFT are also on, have commissioned research, and it's going to be available early next month. And I believe that, well, I would hope that that would address the issues raised in the petition. It's certainly, from the papers, seems to hint that it's going to certainly address the issues.
I mean, I think this petition has been in the system for quite a while, and I do think there was an acknowledgement there was a genuine issue here, and that they were wrestling, they were recognised that there was that the problems did need to be addressed. My own view is that I think that I have confidence that the Scottish Government has made a commitment to look at this, and it may be that we would want to draw to the attention of the Minister for Older People and Equalities the outstanding equalities concerns raised by the petition in his most recent written submission, and to ensure that they continue to be informed of this. But I think in large part you could say the petitioner themselves has been successful in focusing on these concerns. So with the suggestion that we write to the Minister for Older People and Equalities, I wonder if we can agree to close the petition.
I would be comfortable with that,
yeah. So I think we can agree to write to the Minister for Older People and Equalities.
Yes.
We would obviously encourage the petitioner to continue dialogue where there are concerns, and we know, of course, that this was one where his own local MSP was very supportive. So again, if we thought that there was some kind of he had further concerns, that is another means by which these matters can be raised.
Yeah.
So I think we would agree to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government is currently undertaking work to develop new guidance on shared space schemes, and that the petitioner is engaged in this.
Agreed.
That's agreed. In that case, can we thank the petitioner very much for their involvement in the Public Petitions Committee, and of course they are able to return with a petition after a year if they felt that these matters had not been resolved. Okay, thank you for that. If we can then move on to the next continued petition, which is petition 1667 on the review of mental health and incapacity legislation lodged by W. Hunter Watson. The petition calls on the Scottish Government to conduct a wide review of Scottish mental health and incapacity legislation, and when doing so, to take due account of recent developments in international human rights law. At the last consideration of this petition in March 2019, the Minister for Mental Health gave evidence on the Scottish Government's work to review mental health legislation. The Minister outlined the work of a new review of mental health legislation to build on and complement the work streams which are already underway. These work streams concerned adult support and protection legislation, a review to consider whether the provisions of the 2003 Act fulfil the needs of people with learning disability and autism, and the Adults with Incapacity Scotland Act 2000. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
Forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but I would say that the review has been granted and is underway, and we're expecting an interim report next May. In my opinion, I think that the government are doing what they've been asked to do, so I would be satisfied to close this one.
Any other views?
I think
Brian?
This is mental health is a topic that has exercised this Parliament, not just this committee, during this term, quite rightly so. We are doing our own investigation in the mental health space, as well as the work that the government itself is doing. So I think in bringing this petition, the petitioner has added to that work, that workload, quite rightly so. And as Gil Ross has said, I think the government have taken this on board and are working, are doing work in this area. And so I think in that respect, I think the petitioner has been successful. And I would be inclined to agree with Gil Ross here that we probably have taken this as far as we're going to take this.
Okay, any other views?
I think, Chair, I can say at this point that one of my concerns is that it's a reflection of the UN legislation and advice that's coming through at the moment. And I would just flag up the fact that I think that any government, Scottish Government investigations into this actually reflects quite deeply on that in their current process, because I have constituents who have approached me on several occasions about this very issue, and they're real worried about not carrying forward and carrying into legislation in mental health those aspects of the United Nations Charter on mental health. Okay. So I think as long as that's on board, I'm happy with it, but that's my slight query.
Right, it may be that we could just simply write to the Scottish Government, recognise that they've, they're having this review, these concerns have been highlighted, and in that sense, there will clearly be people, including the petitioner, I'm sure, who will be watching the progress of this, and there will be an opportunity, if we feel as if there's a gap, that will be the role of the scrutinising committee and of the Parliament as a whole, and of course if the petitioner felt there were aspects of it that weren't being progressed, that there would be an opportunity to return to ourselves. So I think my sense in the committee is that we're agreeing to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government is undertaking work that addresses the action called for in the petition. We're agreeing to write to the Scottish Government to highlight the points that Maurice Corrie has made, and that we would recognise that there will be work done by the Parliament to test the commitment to have the, to commit to deliver on this review against what people's expectations of it were.
Can I just find a point, Chair, if I may, on what I've just said, is it's also the delivery and the disparity between specialists in delivery of some of the treatment, and that's what's been coming through, and that's something that the constituents are keen to have addressed in relation, and that's where it links back to the United Nations Charter. All right. Okay,
and so are we agreeing to close the petition on that basis?
Agreed.
If that's agreed. And again, we'd wish to thank the petitioner, recognise the progress has been made in part by the petition itself, and of course the opportunity they may have at a later stage to reflect on the way in which that review has been delivered. And thank them for their engagement with the Public Petitions Committee. Yeah. The next continued petition for consideration is Petition 1701 on Change the Law to Allow Adoption for People over the age of 18, lodged by Nathan Sparling. At last consideration of this petition in December last year, we agreed to write to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Law Commission to seek their views in relation to a suggestion made by the Law Society of Scotland that further research is needed in the area of adult adoption, including obtaining international comparisons. We also noted the Scottish Government's position that current adoption legislation in Scotland strikes, quote, an appropriate balance between the interests involved. In noting this view, we questioned whether there was therefore an implication by the Scottish Government that there is a conflict of interest and whether this position seeks a balance between these two interests. The committee therefore agreed to explore the issue further with the Scottish Government. Written submissions have been received from the Scottish Government and the Scottish Law Commission and are included in our meeting papers. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Brian?
I think when this petition was first brought forward, I thought the petitioner made, some very, very strong points, very good points, and on the face of it, I think, I was going in that general direction. I think in the submissions that have now come into us from the Law Society, from the government, the complexities of what are being asked for here has definitely muddied the waters a bit. And I think I'm kind of struck with this some of the responses to the government have made to the petitioner around the points that changing names and official records can be amended. Arrangement for succession are already there and already in place. And all they all within that respect the individual's right to private family life. I'm actually finding it quite difficult to work out where we can go with this particular petition. I think it's obviously a very personal issue for people in this particular situation, but the complexities that have arisen and the resource required to me have made this a lot less clear as to where we can possibly go with this. I don't know if that's probably not helped in the slightest, but I'm actually at a loss to see where we go with this, to be honest.
Thanks, Brian. Gail?
Yeah, this was one of these petitions that when I first read the petition, I thought, well, you know, it's an entirely sensible suggestion. It's probably completely straightforward. And then you get into the evidence and you read, you know, as Brian said, the different submissions, and you realise that it's a lot more complex than actually you first thought. And, you know, I have absolute, complete sympathy with where the petitioner is coming from and wants to go to. I think that the bit that struck me in the evidence was when the Minister came back and said of the possible implications for vulnerable adults, and that hasn't been worked through, and we don't know what the possible effects of that might be. I know it's a couple of years into the future, but we do have the possibility of the Scottish Law Commission putting it into a future reform. And I do see that the petitioner has stated his willingness to work with them in that respect. Again, I agree with Brian that unfortunately I can't see us as a committee, given, you know, our limitations in this. I do believe that we have probably taken it as far as we can.
Okay. I think one thing the committee has afforded was the opportunity for the case to be made, and the petitioner certainly did take that opportunity and made a very compelling argument. The question then is, how do you take that compelling argument and actually deliver it? And you know, perhaps there are consequences that we had not foreseen, and I think we've had useful responses in that regard. But there is no doubt that that issue is now something that people are alive to. Yep. And you know, they're not simply not thinking about it. It's a question of whether it can be done. And I think that Gail's suggestion that the fact the Scottish Law Commission may in the future consult on this, and the petitioner said they're happy to engage with that, is useful too. Do I get the sense then that we're agreeing to close the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government does not support the action called for in the petition? We recognise the complexities, but we do see that there has been progress in the sense that the Law Commission itself is going to, at some point, be looking at this.
I also think you need to state, Convener, that, and you made the point earlier, is to encourage the petitioner to engage. And I think to give a reason, I hate closing these things just for that sake. I think we must give some encouragement to engagement, and that must be stated in that. So it's sort of he or she directly. It's a very complex issue.
My sense is that the petitioner is very engaged, and clearly, you know, I think that the committee was, you know, took very close consideration of what was being said, because it was presented in a way that we found, well, maybe only speaking for myself, it was compelling and obviously very personal to him, and we appreciated that. So I think we are agreeing to close the petition. We're recognising this work, and we'd encourage the petitioner to continue to be engaged with that. Would thank him for his engagement with the Public Petitions Committee, and of course there is an opportunity in a year's time to bring this or similar petition back if they felt that sufficient progress has not been made. So we can agree that and move on to the next petition for consideration, which is petition 1706 on introducing a law to allow pets in rented and supported accommodation, lodged by Geraldine Mackenzie. At our last consideration of this petition in May of this year, we noted the very brief nature of the Scottish Government's written submission. We therefore agreed to write to the Scottish Government to request further information in relation to homeless people who have pets, and whether pet ownership comes within the scope of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. A written submission has been received from the Scottish Government, as well as a further submission from the petitioner, and these are included in our meeting papers. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Right?
Yeah, I was struck by the government response around the difficulty of imposing law on individual landlords. I think we would all agree that we would encourage landlords to accept pets, and especially when so many homeless people have pets. We would encourage that type of behaviour, but I think it's extremely difficult to create legislation that imposes upon landlords that they must allow allow pets into their properties. However supportive of the petition we are, I think it'd be difficult to do that, and I think given that the government are suggesting non-legislative approach to this particular issue is their preferred option. I'm of a mind that this is as far as we can take this particular issue. Having raised it, a petitioner having raised this within this petition, and we also have raised that then with the Scottish Government. I think this is about as far again as this committee can take this.
We haven't. I don't think we've been given notification of the report. Is it report on the homeless? So it's now completed. Yeah. This is now completed. It tells us that it's not yet been published. I mean, what I'm struck by in this, the issue I think that we focused on quite a lot in the last consideration was the fact that homeless people would choose not to go into accommodation if it meant them separating from their pet, and that can't be helpful in anybody's view. And I think that's something that we would be keen to highlight to the Scottish Government. This is something that needs to be addressed, and so we would be interested in what that report is going to say. And I think my sense is that the evidence is that people say, yes, this is an issue. Yes, we can see the benefit to pets for people who are in isolation and lonely, but the legislative route is not maybe the right one. So perhaps in closing the petition, we will be alive to this, that the petitioner themselves could come back, particularly when we see what the report says and whether in fact all that happens is that basically current policy just continues and doesn't really address this question. So I suppose it may be the petition will be vigilant in this, but I imagine that the relevant parliamentary committee will also be relevant in this in terms of a report that's coming out that's talking about homelessness and a concern that some people are not even able to access the support they really need because of the bond they have with their pets, which is entirely understandable.
Yeah. Also, from a veterans' point of view, we've got issues here because unfortunately our veterans sadly who are homeless on the street, but some of them have dogs. They have post-traumatic stress disorder, which can be alleviated by having an animal, as you know, a dog. So this causes another issue into looking at that. Whilst on one minute we're encouraging him to be in accommodation, on the other hand we've got this thing against it, or rather not helping it. And I think possibly maybe to work with the local authorities to see how they can address it on a sort of bylaw regulation.
Well, I suppose the question is to which people are living in private rent accommodation. The petition makes that point as well, that and you simply say, well, you can't regulate for private landlords. Well, in other areas we would. The question is whether we can do anything more about this petition at this stage. There is no doubt that it raises important concerns. There is no doubt there's a report sitting there which has not yet been published, and it may be that again in closing the petition we are recognising that there are important questions here that the petitioner has raised, and that while the petition itself won't continue, we note that there is work ongoing, and the question will be that at the point where that report is published, I am absolutely confident this will be something that will be addressed through parliamentary scrutiny.
Recommend a dog for company or whatever is contradictory. This is what I think needs to be pointed out as we close it.
Okay, so we are agreeing, I think, to close the petition that on the basis that the Scottish Government and other stakeholders are of the view that non-legislative measures are more proportionate to address the action called for in the petition, and we would hope that the report that's addressing, particularly around homelessness, will have a focus on that. But again, that we would thank the petitioner very much for highlighting this issue, recognising that actually, as has been highlighted by Maurice Corey, that in specific personal circumstances, this can make a huge difference to people's lives and their capacity to recover from trauma. And that we would, encourage the petitioner that if they feel, and again, within a year's time, that there's not been sufficient progress, that to come back to the Public Petitions Committee. But we would want to thank them very much for highlighting an issue that is, I think it's important that is in the public domain, and that landlords themselves should be alive to these issues.
Absolutely.
Okay, is that agreed?
Yeah.
Okay, in that case, if we can move on. The next continued petition is petition 1716 on the full review of mental health service provision across the NHS in Scotland, lodged by Karen McKeown and Gillian Murray, which calls on the Scottish Government to carry out a full review of mental health services across the NHS in Scotland to ensure that policy and practice is delivered consistently across the country. At the last consideration of this petition in April 2019, the committee agreed to write to the Scottish Government and other key stakeholders on the action called for in the petition, particularly in relation to NHS signposting to local third sector organisations, risk assessment tools used by clinicians to assess patients, the provision of out-of-hours crisis support, and the call for an automatic fatal accident inquiry for every person who dies by suicide and has been in contact with mental health services in the 3 months prior to their death. The Clerk's note summarises the responses that have been received and highlights the number of actions which the Scottish Government has taken and is committed to taking regarding mental health provision in Scotland. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Right.
I think that one of the previous petitions, the petitions here obviously raising a hugely important issue that is recognised cross-party within this Parliament. As I already said, there's a great deal of work being done in this area around mental health, and this, it's probably talked about in the chamber almost every week, and in recognition of the work that the government are undertaking in terms of review of mental health services. I think there's a lot of what the petition is being asked for, that significant work is covering or addressing much of the action that's called for in the petition. So I think, from my view, I think the petitioners have significantly added to our understanding of the issue and our investigation into the issue, and that hugely appreciative of that. But again, we're probably at a stage now where this committee has taken this as far as we can.
I was quite struck by, I mean, this is also an issue that's been, and the petitioners have been engaged around this debate more broadly than in this committee. And I was quite struck by what I think is really a theme of the petitioner's response, which is one thing to have a review, but actually the problem is the gap between what's supposed to be happening and what's actually happening. And that experience, which has clearly had a huge impact on the petitioners, how do we ensure that in the review, that sense of, it comes off the page when you read it, the frustration of the gap between what their lived experience was of it and what was supposed to be happening, can be brought to the attention of government. I wonder whether, if we are agreeing to close the petition, and it's not to say that we therefore think this matter is resolved, far from it, but the review is at least affording an opportunity to have that discussion, that we write to Scottish Government and highlight the petitioner's submission in particular.
Yeah.
Because I think they, it's I certainly wouldn't want the petitioners to think that we believe that's been sorted and we can just move on. But that sense in which actually it's one thing to say these are the things that are available. We're telling you that's not the way it's happening on the ground. This is what happened to us, even when things were supposed to happen. And in fact, there is an issue about even the way in which the question of the role of the third sector, I think it's important to highlight the Scottish Government, the points that are made by the petition in that regard.
You're absolutely right, Convener, but I think these issues and the frustration that comes out of the page is reflected a lot in what across the chamber is raised raised on a consistent basis. I know even in terms of the third sector, I raised that last week. The mental health services within the third sector. These are issues now that are very alive in the Parliament, and the frustration and the lived experience that you speak about, convener, are being raised consistently by members across the chamber. So again, as I say, it's definitely not a resolved issue, but it's not an issue that will go away with the close of petition. There's a drive now towards finding a solution.
And if we look at the evidence that we got for the petition that we just considered about the review of mental health, the Minister for Mental Health did say that the review will be stakeholder-driven and evidence-led. We want to gather views from a wider range of people as possible. And, you know, given the amount of work that the petitioners have already put into this, I think, I mean, I don't know if we can recommend that you know, they are feeding into that consultation as well, just to make sure that their views are heard. I mean, obviously, the Minister for Mental Health has all the information here already.
I think,
Morris?
yes. I think, fair enough, there's a direct link between the one from Mr. Hunter Watson's petition, which we talked about earlier on, and I continue the points that I made in that, and I think there is something that needs to be well looked after. So both have got very valid points to continue any investigations or reviews, Chair, that needs to be done, because of this consistency of deliverability across the country is terribly important, because that's where I'm getting, as you know, the constituents coming to me, and it really is, it's a curious egg situation, good in parts and not good in parts. And I certainly would say, you put that message out that those who have a deep interest in this do engage with the reviews.
Yeah, but I mean, you're also right about signposting and referring on to other organisations as well. I think is important.
Okay, I think my sense is that we're agreeing that we do want to close the petition, not because we think the matter is resolved, but because we think there is a vehicle through which that conversation is going to continue, and that the test will be whether that significant work that we would be highlighting to Scottish Government, that the significant work which they have identified actually does address the action called for in the petition, and that we would be writing to them, particularly highlighting the comments that have been made in the most recent submission, and that we know that whether this Public Petitions Committee is discussing it or not, it's very clear that this is an issue that across the Parliament and across its committees, these are matters are regarded seriously, but there is something very powerful about the testimony which I think should concentrate people's minds. And we know this has been a campaign that these families have been involved in and have had a huge impact, I think, certainly on all of us here. So in closing the petition, we'd want to thank the petitioners very much for, and it can't be easy when you're already dealing with the consequence of your own experiences, but to bring this petition to the committee, there is work ongoing, but we have to ensure that there is a focus on whether that it does address the issues of the petition. That's what we'll be saying to the Scottish Government. We want to thank them very much for doing so, and of course remind them that within a year's time they're able to produce if necessary, they can of course return to the Public Petitions Committee on this matter. Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay, in that case, can we move on then to the next petition, which is the next continued petition, 1718 on body cameras for the NHS, lodged by Alec Wallace, which calls on the Scottish Government to introduce body cameras for all NHS frontline and theatre staff. At the last consideration of the petition in May 2019, the committee agreed to write to the Scottish Government and key stakeholders the committee agreed to write to the Scottish Government and key stakeholder groups. Submissions have now been received from the Scottish Government and the Royal College of Nursing Scotland. The committee has also received a submission from the petitioner in response. The submissions have been summarised in the Clerk's note, which explains that there are a number of concerns relating to the use of body cameras in these settings, including serious ethical issues, issues related to data protection, concerns around confidentiality and capacity, and the financial implications of such initiatives. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of these ones that I have huge sympathy for. But the very fact that the Royal College of Nursing and the Scottish Government have both come back and said that they have issues with privacy and consent. Really kind of set alarm bells ringing. And in the petitioner's submission, in response to that, they state that patients could be asked for consent. But I think if to put it bluntly, if you're going to be a patient that's going to be causing problems in a hospital to NHS frontline staff, you're not going to give your consent to them wearing a body camera. I think that, you know, the Royal College of Nursing have consulted their members. They are on the front line and they have said that there are serious ethical issues with this. So I don't believe that we can take it any further at this point.
Okay, any other views?
I would agree with what Ross has said.
Brian?
I should probably declare my daughter as a frontline NHS medic, and the one thing that doesn't really get covered in here, but which it struck me was the way that our frontline staff are continually questioned on decisions that they've made and treatments they've given in stressful situations, and then having to try and remember times and places and treatments they've done would possibly help in that. So I've got to say, I was going along the line of this could be quite helpful, and then you come across ethics and the not the insurmountable cost that would be required to deliver these. And I think I kind of I've come to the conclusion, same as Gail Ross, is that this is extremely problematic, and another solution would need to be found, I think.
Okay, any other views?
I think where some of the problems come is also the reception area within hospitals and A&E, and I'm not aware if there is camera coverage on that CCTV, but I probably think there might be. But I think that's obviously appropriate, and you see all the notices about abusive behaviour. But I think you'll start crossing that line about, you know, getting into the personal issues and things like that Gail raised is absolutely fundamentally wrong. And I mean, you know, if there's a problem, obviously, then other staff can be brought in to sort of assess as well. So I think there's enough protection in place.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a way it's depressing that the petitioner feels the need to bring forward this petition, because as far as I can see, it's because of concerns about the way in which staff are treated. Yeah. And it's a protection to staff. And what does that say about what's happening in our A&E and elsewhere? The staff need that protection. So I think the motivation is a very positive one. Yeah. And he does note that there was a trial project in Northamptonshire where they reported that use of body cameras had a positive experience and positive outcome for patients, and whether this is an issue also about, you know, the stories we've heard about the maltreatment of patients in certain circumstances and confidence of their families that they're being treated properly. How is that brought out into the public domain? So these are, to me, I think the petitioner is highlighting an area which is profoundly depressing, that both patients in particular circumstances could be abused, vulnerable patients could be denied their rights, but equally that staff are at threat. So I think we recognise the challenge. Yeah. It seems at this stage, however, the solution that's been offered is not one that the profession and those round about them feel is the appropriate one. So I think we would want to, I think we're agreeing that we're going to close the petition and under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders, on the basis the Scottish Government has stated that the cost of this proposal are prohibitive for health boards and do not provide value for money, and that there are concerns by the professionals involved, but that we do recognise the underlying issues that have prompted this petition are serious ones. And I'm confident that these are issues that are being addressed in the system, because both for patients' rights and for protection of staff, it's clearly something that people want to consider. I think we're agreeing to close the petition, but again, we want to thank the petitioner for their petition and for engaging with the Public Petitions Committee the way they did. And of course, as I've repeated already, they are able to bring in within a year's time, petition in, I should say, in a year's time, and beyond that, a petition in similar or equivalent terms if they so choose. Okay, if we can then move on to the final continued petition for consideration today, which is petition 1719 on the review of fire safety stay put policy lodged by Rachel Gibson on behalf of tenants at Cartcraigs Road. At our last consideration of this petition in May of this year, the committee agreed to ask the Scottish Government and various organisations for advice as to the consistency and provision of fire safety advice concerning multi-storey residential buildings that is available across all regions of Scotland. Our papers confirmed that the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service all stated that the stay put policy is the preferred national approach, adhered to by all UK fire and rescue services, and drives consistency of evacuation strategies practices in the UK. The Scottish Government also noted this national approach in its written submission. In her written submission, the petitioner raises concerns that the measures advocated by the NFCC and included in its written submission to the committee are not enforced in her multi-storey flats. This includes there being no smoke control provisions in escape routes or increased communication with residents or an evacuation strategy. She has also received advice from Glasgow Housing Association that refurbishment to her specific building did not qualify the building for evacuation sound alerts. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. I think this is a very sensitive issue. I mean, it clearly relates to Grenfell, where my understanding is that the question was not the stay put policy, it was the fact that there was flammable material in the cladding, which created huge risk. And it, there is clearly for the petitioner concerns about her specific building, and actually this petition is a constituent of mine, or could be a constituent of mine, so it may be that there's an option for the petitioner to go to the local MSP to ensure that these questions about that specific area are raised with the Glasgow Housing Association, which is actually beyond the remit of the Public Petitions Committee, because we can only deal with national policy rather than individual circumstances, but that would be an option. And I don't think I'd be stepping too far outside my own remit to say that as a Glasgow MSP I would recognise as one of many to have a responsibility to raise these concerns directly as an individual constituent case. But I do think that that's my feeling, that there have been responses to the general policy that the petitioner highlights, but if there are specific concerns, it's not necessarily the Public Petitions Committee to continue it in order for these concerns to be pursued. Yeah. Brian?
As you pointed out, this is an extremely sensitive issue, and my feeling is that since the tragedy in Grenfell, that progress has not been quick. It's not been fast enough, and I don't know whether other members have that same issue with or that same feeling with their the constituents that they look after. And but the specificity of this petition is around the stay put policy. And I note that it is the government's intention to include those who live in these particular dwellings, to include them in development of any future policy. So if we look specifically at this petition, to me it seems that progress has been made. And that the petitioner has the capability of inputting into that the development of that policy. But it's on the background of I said, I don't think enough. I'm uncomfortable with the speed in which progress has been made in general in high-rise buildings.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I mean, obviously, this is, we want people to feel safe in their own homes, and given what happened, we can see why there would be concerns. I just wonder, given that the Local Government and Communities Committee published a report and intends to return to the topic, would it be beyond the scope of referring this to that committee so that they can include that in any future work?
Yep. I think that would reflect the fact that we understand the seriousness of the issue, that their concerns about being out with consideration, something that the local government committee may want to look at. I think that rather than simply closing it would make sense that we actually refer it on. And I repeat the point that the individual case and individual circumstances of anybody who's concerned about this, they do have recourse to their own MSPs to ensure that they can be, that direct conversation between the tenants and the landlord can be facilitated as well. So I think...
Sorry, the Chair, if I may. I think it's very important that the stay put policy is key to this. I'm afraid whatever else we talk about, the material and the buildings of Grenville Tower, it's this stay put thing that's going to hit, is in people's minds. I think you're absolutely right. This needs to be referred on. Because whatever we say, that's the issue that came out of that report. Okay. Okay, in that case, we're agreeing to refer the petition to the Local Government and Communities Committee under Rule 15.6.2 of Standing Orders, and to repeat the point that the Public Petitions Committee is not the only vehicle for individuals to have their concerns raised with their own landlords, and that's something that is also on offer to people. So we're agreeing to do that, and we would again want to thank the petitioner for bringing this to the attention of the committee, where, as Gail has said, we're very alive to the importance of people feeling safe in their own homes, given what the tragedy that we saw in Grenfell, and indeed a recent fire where there was concerns too. And again, to thank the petitioner and remind them the opportunity they have to bring back a petition in similar terms after a year of consideration from today.
Agreed.
Okay, if that's agreed, can I just suspend briefly before we move to consideration of new petitions? Call the meeting back to order, and we move to agenda item 2, consideration of new petitions. The first new petition for consideration today is petition 1756 on the review of housing legislation to protect people experiencing domestic or elder abuse, lodged by James Mackey. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to review current housing legislation in circumstances where a non-tenant has been responsible for domestic or elder abuse. A person living with a tenant may have statutory occupancy rights, even though they're not a tenant. For spouses and civil partners, the occupancy rights of the non-entitled spouse or civil partner are automatic. For a non-entitled cohabitant, an application must be made to the court to have occupancy rights declared. If a person living in a property does not have these statutory occupancy rights or another legal right to occupy, the Shelter Scotland website says tenants can use self-help measures to make that person leave the property. For example, changing the locks and not letting the person back in. They can also apply to the court for an ejection order. The Homelessness Etc. Scotland Act 2003 provides that applicants presenting as homeless who have fled any kind of abuse can be provided with alternative housing and support by the local authority. A homeless person or household fleeing abuse is able to present to any local authority in the United Kingdom. Last year, the Scottish Government carried out a consultation on a new form of protective court order. It can be applied for by someone other than the victim, such as the police. In response to a written question, the Scottish Government noted their Ending Homelessness Together action plan will be published in November 2019 and aims to transform how these risks of homelessness receive help. It will include a commitment to developing a pathway to prevent homelessness for survivors of domestic abuse. The petitioner has recently submitted a written submission in response to our SPICE briefing, which we have before us today. The petitioner states, yes, there is legislation in place, however the legislation takes time to evict abusers and often money. In the meantime, the abuser continues to live within the property and continues their abuse. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Gail?
I think that we need to write to the Scottish Government because I'm not clear through the action plan that we talk about just what exactly the changes are that are being made. And I do agree with the petitioner about the time it takes for these things to happen. And I just think, you know, it's all very well for us to be saying to people, well, change your locks or get an injunction, but, you know, they're absolutely right. In the meantime, this is still going on. So I think that we need to definitely, in the first instance, write to the Scottish Government and possibly other key stakeholders as well.
Okay, any other views? I think we want there is clearly an issue and has been long term, and women's groups and others have campaigned for, where a tenant can end up in a position where they're having to, their housing, their landlord may be dealing with them with problems with antisocial behaviour around the premises, which have been caused by somebody who's an abuser and is, you know, doesn't stay there but can come and cause grief. But also that question of how, as has been highlighted here, how the system works when somebody's in those circumstances. I think to write to the Scottish Government, and we can perhaps identify appropriate stakeholders around housing and the police who may have a view on this. So we can, I mean, I have no doubt that people who are providing housing, police and the Scottish Government are aware of a lot of these issues, but it's a question of how they address the concerns that petitioner has raised.
Absolutely.
No, I think if you try and put yourself in the position of the person being abused and then seeking to have that person removed or similar, and in the length of time it takes, that would, for me, would prohibit an abuser taking that sort of action, because if you're being abused and then you bring that into the mix, you would imagine that would the potential to raise the level of abuse. So I think the petition raises a really important issue. I agree we need to write to the Scottish Government. I think the stakeholders, Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers is potentially one.
Can I suggest what we do is we delegate to clerks out to identify a list of the most appropriate folk who maybe would be engaged in this area and can help us in our consideration of the petition.
Yep.
Okay, so in that case, we're agreeing to write to the Scottish Government, seeking its views, and we will identify and write to key stakeholders to seek their views, and we can, I'm sure the clerks will have a good sense of where the most appropriate people to contact would be. So, and we can thank the petitioner for submitting their petition. If we can now move to the second new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1757 on reduced actuarial reductions to the Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme, lodged by Liz Maguire. The petition calls on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government significantly to reduce the levels of reduction to Scottish Local Government Pension Scheme to ensure that today's low-paid workers do not become even poorer pensioners. The Public Service Pensions Act of 2013 reformed the 6 largest public service pension schemes in the UK. The schemes for the Armed Forces, the Civil Service, NHS, teachers, police, firefighters and the Local Government Pension Scheme. Key features of the new scheme included pension benefits based on career average revalued earnings, a pension age linked to the state pension age for teachers, local government, NHS and the civil service, a pension age of 60 for members of the schemes for the police, firefighters and armed forces. The actuarial reduction referred to in the petition is based on the length of time that a member retires early. That is the period between the date the benefits are paid and the normal pension age of the member. The earlier a member retires, the greater the reduction. And I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. I should declare an interest as someone who has a teacher's pension. No? Do you have any views?
I think it would seem in the first instance that writing to the Scottish Government to seek their views on the issue the petitioner raised would be our first course of action, I think.
I'm wondering if, as part of this is the consequence of the pension age increasing and people who feel that they're no longer able to continue working and having to take early retirement, and the penalty for that can be, well, the suggestion is that it has a particular impact on low-paid workers, and that's quite an interesting area, important area for us for the Scottish Government to look at. So we're agreeing to write to the Scottish Government seeking its views on the action called for in the petition.
Can I declare an interest? I'm also on a local government pension.
Okay. Thank you for that. We now move on to the third new petition for consideration today, which is petition 1758 on End Greyhound Racing in Scotland, lodged by Gil Docherty on behalf of Scotland against greyhound exploitation. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to put an end to greyhound racing in Scotland. And can I welcome Mark Ruskell, MSP, for his attendance for the consideration of this petition. There is no statutory regulation of greyhound racing in Scotland. The Greyhound Board of Great Britain provides rules and regulation on the welfare of greyhounds and facilities at licensed tracks. These include requirements on inspections, that a veterinary surgeon may be present at all races, and detailed rules on racing surfaces, traps, fencing, kennels, etc. The GBGB rules of racing also state, quote, "Every person subject to the GBGB rules of racing shall have full regard to greyhound welfare and shall accept the provisions of the Animal Welfare Act 2006. These requirements do not apply to independent greyhound tracks. Scotland has one regulated and one independent greyhound track. The Scottish Government believes that the provisions of the Animal Health and Welfare Scotland Act 2006 are sufficient to ensure that action can be taken if the welfare of greyhounds, whether still racing or retired, is not being met. In the 2018-19 programme for government, the Scottish Government committed to continue work to introduce and reform licensing of animal activities, including animal sanctuaries, rehoming centres, breeding and the use of animals in public display or performance. There is no specific mention of horse racing or greyhound racing in the programme for government. However, the scope of reforms to licensing of animal activities, including their use in public displays or performances, will be considered in due course after discussions with stakeholders. And I wonder if it would be worthwhile asking Mark Ruskell to make a contribution at this point, and that will help us inform what we may want to do with the petition.
I should probably declare an interest in that I'm owner of an ex-racing greyhound. His backstory was that he had a broken leg. The broken leg got no treatment at all. He was raced again and again and was lame and was clearly not winning any races, so he was moved on by his trainer, thankfully to the Scottish Greyhound Sanctuary, who successfully rehomed him with our family. But he's a very lucky dog. Most of the dogs that are no longer cutting it anymore, they're either just put down, or at the track, or they're disposed of in other ways. And the petitioners point out that 5,000 dogs were injured in 1 year. That's a trend that's going up, and 2,000 dogs were either died greyhound racing or subsequently, euthanized. So I think it's quite clear, talking to the petitioners and a number of people, that stakeholders, that the code of practice that Greyhound Board of Great Britain have drawn up is not worth the paper it's written on. We had a situation this year where you had in the summer temperatures of over 30 degrees and dogs were still being raced at the Shorefield Stadium. And then, of course, you've got, as you pointed out, convener, the situation where there are some tracks, such as Thornton in Fife, which aren't even covered by the GBGB code of practice. It's also been very difficult to see enforcement, particularly under the 2006 Animal Health and Welfare Act. There's been notable, well-documented cases of trainers feeding dogs cocaine. Various abuses taking place, well documented, and yet no convictions have been brought forward as a result of that. Discussing this with the SSPCA and police, I'm very concerned that this doesn't seem to be a priority, or that there are issues around evidence, which is basically resulting in very few convictions coming forward, whatsoever. The government, as you pointed out, convener, during the Wild Animals in Travelling Circuses bill evidence, the government made the commitment that they would review the regulations that relate to other forms of animal performance. We've banned the use of wild animals in travelling circuses. There are other types of animal performance that could possibly be banned or possibly be further regulated. They did agree to bringing forward a review on that. But as you point out, there's no specific commitment to reviewing regulations in relation to greyhounds and greyhound racing. The bill that's currently before the Eclair Committee, the Animal Health and Welfare sort of amendment bill, is quite narrow in scope. It does look at sentencing. I think it's not clear whether an increase in maximum sentencing for offences could impact on the way that the abuse of greyhounds is investigated by Police Scotland and the SSPCA. So there are unanswered questions there about whether that bill could make specific recommendations in relation to greyhounds or would have an impact on this issue. And I guess my sort of personal thought on this is that there's a good opportunity now in the Eclair Committee, for the Eclair Committee to take this petition, should you wish to refer it early, because we're considering the Animal Health and Welfare Bill. We're in the last 18 months of this Parliament, and we expect regulations might be coming. So,
Do you think that really the purpose and aim of the petition, or your own views, that basically there shouldn't be greyhound racing, or that the regulation should be more effective and policing should take it more seriously? So because it's two quite different things. If you're motivated by it saying, well, actually this shouldn't happen, or do you think it's regulatable, if there's such a word? Do you think effective regulation could make a difference?
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, my personal views is that I don't think there's a place for greyhound racing on ethical or welfare grounds, and I think it comes into a similar category as wild animals in travelling circuses. However, there are those who believe that regulatory reform would be the best route, and I guess I would be interested as a member of the Eclair Committee to explore that territory. I think what's clear is that the industry has had a long time to consider regulation. It's going down a voluntary regulatory route, and yet there are dogs being fed cocaine and raced in 30 degrees heat. It's not working. So I have real concerns about whether this industry is capable of reform. And then there's the unregulated side of the industry, what's happening in Fife at the moment, which, is pretty horrific from some of the stories I'm hearing on the ground.
I don't know. It's an industry that is, I mean, I know Shawfield, but is it something that happens, is it something that happens routinely across the United Kingdom, or are there international comparators? Is this a feature of people's lives in other parts of the world?
Understanding is that the industry is struggling, and then there are a lot of parallels here with wild animals and travelling circuses. You know, it's starting to dwindle as an industry. It's no longer becoming a widely popular pastime for people to come and watch greyhound racing anymore. So it's declining anyway, and it does raise both ethical and animal welfare questions. So I think there is a question about what the Scottish Government is then doing in that context about it.
Okay, Gail?
Yeah, and thanks, Mark, for coming in. It's been really useful to hear what you've got to say. I mean, even though Scottish Government are saying, you know, that there are mechanisms for dealing with these sort of animal welfare abuses, I mean, your figures would not bear that out, to be honest. And I think that, you know, given what Mark Ruskell has said about, you know, the bill that's currently going through the other committee, I would agree to refer it. I think that's a perfect place for it, so you can give it the scrutiny that it deserves.
Brian?
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for coming in. Greyhounds, great dogs, as I'm sure you'll testify to. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about greyhound racing at all. Never been to one. I do know that the body do these dogs like to run, but. To me, it looks like, you know, there's an Animal Welfare Act there that legislates for any animal, irrespective of the circumstances in which it is, that and a code of practice that obviously isn't being enforced, or whether that's an ability to be enforced because it's such a small and reducing sport. I mean, I'm inclined to look at the way in which. Horse racing, for example, is legislated, and it's a much bigger sport, and therefore much more in the public eye, and therefore the regulations tend to be much stricter, much tighter. So it's certainly, you know, it's not something I've considered before, but I do like the Mark's idea that the Eclair Committee that are looking at this. I would be quite happy to take the evidence we have here and the petition here and pass that across to the Eclair Committee with interest, actually.
Yes, I agree with what Brian says there. Can I ask Mark Ruskell a question? If you were to ban greyhound racing, would that not drive it underground? And we'd have a more horrendous problem?
I mean, effectively, there is a kind of almost an underground greyhound racing industry at the moment because you've got unregulated track in Fife. I mean, if greyhound racing was to take place, you'd need, you know, an area to do that. And I think it would be pretty obvious where that would be taking place. It would have to be a particular type of track, and it would have to be laid out. So I think it's quite easy to enforce it, to enforce a ban or enforce regulation. In terms of understanding where this practice is taking place.
But even so, do you not think that they'll find ways around to hold these events unregulated? I'm thinking dog fighting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's potentially easier to hide a dog fight in an enclosed area than a greyhound race. I mean, my dog likes to run, and he needs quite a long track to get up to speed. But yeah, I mean, the issue here is about, you know, who is currently enforcing it, and there is an enforcement gap. I see that, you know, unfortunately with the SSPCA and Police Scotland. You know, I don't see the kind of visits to the Thornton track that are really needed to investigate what I hear is going on there.
So it has to be licensed. So we're saying the non-regulated ones have to be licensed under the GBGB.
Right, we're now getting into the nuts and bolts of what you would be looking at in terms of this petition. My sense is the committee recognises the sense in the suggestion that we refer to the Eclair Committee, and don't ask me what that stands for. I'm sure the official report can write it out in full for everybody. But I think we'd be agreed to do that. We recognise the issues that have been highlighted. The question of whether it should be banned or regulated, or how it's regulated, would be something for the committee to consider. So is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, so we're agreeing to refer it. We want to thank the petitioner for bringing this to the attention of the committee, and thank Mark Ruskell for his attendance.
Indeed.
If we can now move on to the next new petition, which is petition 1759 on equal school hours for all children in Scotland, lodged by Susan Crooks, which calls on the Scottish Government to ensure that all children receive the same teaching hours across the whole of Scotland. Our briefing explains that the Schools General Scotland Regulations 1987 provides that schools must be open for a minimum of 190 days in a school year. However, the length of these days is not prescribed, and it's largely for local authorities to determine the structure of when schools are open. Section 21 of the Education Scotland Act 2016 provides ministers with the power to make regulations on the minimum number of school hours in a school year, with some exceptions. The power would also enable ministers to prescribe the meaning of learning hours. However, Section 21 of the 2016 Act is not fully enforced, and the Scottish Government has not made regulations to prescribe a minimum number of hours. Our briefing explains that there is some disparity across local authorities at present. In 2015, Reform Scotland sent freedom of information requests to all local authorities asking about contact hours in primary and secondary schools. They found that, quote, the variance between the highest provision and lowest provision was 149 hours per year in primary and 245 hours in secondary, based on local authority area. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action. Right.
The one thing that strikes me is the petition's correlation between teaching and learning and the number of hours that's performed. I would suggest that there's a lot more to it than that around what is taught and who is teaching. But it does raise a really interesting issue that I was unaware of. As you say, every day is a school day in here. But I think that given what the petition is highlighting in terms of disparity, I think definitely we need to start off with the government, see what the position is on what the petition raises, and there are other stakeholders obviously that would have an interest in this petition that we should seek their views as well.
Okay, we agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the petitioner refers specifically to Highland Council, and if it were a couple of years ago I would have had to declare an interest because my son goes to Highland Council primary school. I think maybe it would be beneficial for us to write to Highland Council to ask them why the decision was made to have primaries 1 to 3 finish at 2:30 and then 4 to 7 finish at 3 o'clock.
Okay. The suggestion is that we write specifically to COSLA, who would have an overview, but I suppose the question is whether this is only in Highland. I don't think we want to open it up to write to every local authority when it's really not an issue for them. Yeah. I suppose we could write specifically to Highland if the petition is real.
Yeah, we have it already in Eastern Bartonshire. Same.
Right.
Yeah,
Can I suggest what we do is we write to Scottish Government and we write to COSLA in the first instance, and we can, once we have a response from them, we can do. And again, if we can leave to the clerks the decision round which of the stakeholders would be the most appropriate to contact, it may be the teaching unions have a particular view on it, but we recognise, I think as Brian said, it's not necessarily something that we've been aware of, but it would be useful to understand actually what is happening and what is the rationale or the explanation or the justification for the difference. So with that, I think with that we can thank the petitioner, and we will obviously come back to this petition at a later stage. Yeah. Okay. The final new petition on our agenda today is petition 1761, New Housing Regulations, lodged by David Murphy-Shaw. The petition calls for the Scottish Government to establish new housing regulations by replacing current planning regulations with a regulatory framework governing prefabrication properties and companies, and allowing property taxes to take account of the property location, size of plot and number of children living at the property. Our paper for this petition explains the current system of planning and building regulations, and that the primary responsibility for delivery of the planning service in Scotland lies with local authorities and 2 national park authorities. The paper also sets out the current system governing prefabricated houses. I wonder if members have any comments or suggestions for action.
I mean, I think we just have to write to Scottish Government in the first instance to get get the lowdown on what exactly is and isn't taken into account. I can't see that we can go forward without getting that Scottish Government information.
I mean, the petitioner himself provides a lot of information in their views, so
Absolutely.
it would be useful to get a kind of a detailed response from the Scottish Government which addresses these concerns that have been highlighted in the petition.
Absolutely.
I don't think we can pretend to, have a, I will speak for myself now, in-depth knowledge of the issues that have been raised there, but we do think they're worthy of consideration because there's quite a lot that has been highlighted in the petition itself. So with that, we're agreeing to write the Scottish Government seeking its views on the action called for in the petition. Is that agreed?
Yeah.
Okay. In that case, we have reached the end of consideration of petitions today, and I close the meeting.
Thank you.